ready to explore the world of geopolitics. We're about to do a deep dive into The Grand Chessboard, a book that breaks down global strategies and makes it all feel like, well, a giant game of chess.
The author's main idea is that Eurasia, that huge landmass that covers both Europe and Asia, is like a chessboard. In all the different countries, they're the players, constantly maneuvering for power and influence.
Yeah, it's such a cool way to visualize it, right? You can practically see world leaders moving armies and making deals as if they were chess pieces. And speaking of moves, today we'll uncover how America rose to power, who might challenge them, and which regions, those global hotspots, are the most volatile.
We'll also examine what all of this means in the grand scheme of things. What happens if this geopolitical game keeps playing out? Get ready, we're about to explore the strategies that could shape the world for years to come.
Okay, so first let's set the stage. The book talks about geostrategy, which is basically like the art of managing your interests on a global scale.
It's all about understanding geography, resources, and those power dynamics between countries. And the author makes a bold statement. Eurasia is the chessboard on which the struggle for global primacy continues to be played. To really illustrate this, the book shares a fascinating historical anecdote about Hitler and Stalin's secret talks back in 1940.
Wait, those two were actually negotiating?
Well, not exactly working together, but despite being enemies, they did agree on one thing, keeping America out of Eurasia.
So they knew that if America got involved in Eurasia, it would mess up their plans.
Precisely. Both Hitler and Stalin understood just how important Eurasia was for anyone who wanted to rule the world.
It's kind of wild how history repeats itself. Because here we are, decades later, and America is the most powerful country in the world. But how did we go from being isolated across the ocean to being the top dog?
It's quite an evolution. Before World War I, America mostly kept to itself. But the war forced us onto the European stage, kind of like a first step into the world of global power.
Right, it was like a test run for becoming a major player.
Exactly. And then, of course, World War II happened, and that completely reshaped everything. Europe was in ruins, and America rose as a superpower alongside the Soviet Union. That set the stage for the Cold War, this epic geopolitical battle between these two superpowers.
It's fascinating how the book compares America's current position to empires of the past. You know, like the Romans, the Han Dynasty in China, the Mongols, even the British Empire. It's interesting that none of them ever truly dominated the whole world.
That's true. Each one had its own way of maintaining control, but they all had limitations. The Romans, for example, used military force and the appeal of their culture to build their empire. Imagine how impressive Roman architecture and engineering must have been to the people they conquered. It was a powerful way to show off their sophistication.
It's like the Romans were the influencers of their time, right? They built amazing structures and spread their culture, making people want to be part of their world.
Exactly. And then you have the Han Dynasty in China, which relied on a very efficient bureaucracy, a strong sense of shared identity, and the belief that their culture was superior. They had a well-organized government that kept things running smoothly and a strong sense of national pride that united their people.
It's incredible how these ancient empires found different ways to hold on to power. Makes you wonder how America does it today.
Well, that's what's so interesting about this book. It argues that America's global system is totally different from any empire before it.
Different how?
Instead of relying on brute force or cultural dominance, America's power comes from a network of alliances, partnerships, and institutions. Think of it as a giant web, with America at the center, connected to countries all over the world through things like NATO, the UN, and the World Bank.
So it's less about conquering territory and more about building a web of influence.
Exactly. It's a much more subtle and complex approach.
Yeah.
American power isn't just about military might. It's also about economic influence, diplomacy, and promoting democratic values.
That makes sense. So who are the main players in this geopolitical chess game?
The book calls them geostrategic players, the countries that have the power and motivation to shape the world. And one of the biggest potential players is a united Europe, with France and Germany in the lead.
A united Europe! That's a fascinating idea, but hasn't that been more of a dream than reality so far?
True, but the potential is definitely there. Imagine a Europe that acts as one force on the world stage, with a shared economy, military, and foreign policy.
That would be a game changer.
It absolutely would. And then on the other side of the board, we have China, quickly becoming a global powerhouse. Japan is a crucial U.S. ally in that region, trying to balance out China's growing influence. And even though Russia's going through some struggles, we can't count them out. They still have a lot of military power and a desire to regain their lost glory.
So we have this potential superpower in Europe, a rising giant in China, and a wounded bear in Russia, all competing for influence in Eurasia. Sounds like things could get pretty tense.
They absolutely could. And it's not just about these major players. The book also talks about geopolitical pivots. These are countries that might not be superpowers themselves, but their location and resources make them super important in the global power game.
Like those small chess pieces that suddenly become crucial because they control a key square on the board.
Exactly. Take Ukraine, for example. You know how recent events there have shaken up global energy markets? That's a perfect example of how a seemingly small country can become a geopolitical pivot, impacting the strategies of big players like Russia and the US.
So it's all about recognizing those seemingly unimportant players who could suddenly hold a lot of power.
Precisely. And one region that's full of these geopolitical pivots is what the book calls the Eurasian Balkans.
The Eurasian Balkans, what is that exactly?
It's a region that stretches from the Black Sea all the way to western China, down to the Indian Ocean, then over to the Red Sea, and back up to the Black Sea. Picture a giant crescent moon shape cutting through the heart of Eurasia.
Wow, that's a huge area.
It is. It's home to over 400 million people across 25 different countries, many with a mix of ethnicities and religions. It's a region with a history of conflict, and it's ripe for more.
So why call it the Balkans? Isn't that a region in Europe known for, well, its tendency to break apart?
The author compares this area to the Balkans because of its potential for instability. You've got all these different groups fighting for power and resources with outside forces like Russia, Turkey, and Iran, all trying to exert their influence. It's a recipe for tension and conflict.
And to make it even more complicated, the Eurasian Balkans are sitting on top of massive oil and gas reserves. So you have these internal struggles plus major powers fighting for control of these vital resources.
It's a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this region so important to understand, is one of those hot spots that could easily drag in the major players and completely reshape the balance of power in the world.
This is getting intense. And speaking of intense, let's talk about China. Their economic growth has been mind-blowing. But does that automatically make them the next superpower?
That's the big question, isn't it? While China's rise has been remarkable, this book doesn't necessarily buy into the idea that they're destined to dominate the world.
But they're already flexing their muscles in the South China Sea and challenging America's influence in Asia. How can you say their dominance isn't inevitable?
The book argues that China faces some major internal challenges that could hold them back.
Like what?
Well, for one, there's a lot of social and economic inequality in China. You have this huge gap between the wealthy coastal cities and the poorer rural areas, and that kind of disparity can lead to unrest. Plus, you have a dynamic capitalist economy trying to coexist with an authoritarian political system. That tension could cause instability down the road.
So, while China is definitely a force to be reckoned with, they're not invincible. They have their own internal struggles that could derail their ambitions.
Exactly. And then there's the question of how America should deal with this rising power. The book cautions against trying to contain China, saying it would probably backfire and create more hostility.
So, instead of trying to hold China back, we should be looking for ways to cooperate with them.
That's the book's main argument. The idea is to foster a strategic partnership with China, finding common ground on things like trade and climate change, while also managing those areas where we disagree, like Taiwan and human rights.
It's a delicate balancing act, being both cooperative and competitive at the same time, kind of like frenemies on the world stage.
You could say that.
Huh.
And speaking of frenemies, let's not forget about Japan.
Right, Japan. They're America's closest ally in the region, but they also have this complicated relationship with China.
Exactly. They're economically tied to China, but rely on America for their security. It's a tricky situation.
The book talks about the Yoshida Doctrine, which basically kept Japan focused on its economy and under America's protection for decades. But now that the Cold War is over, that approach is being reevaluated.
That's right. Some people in Japan are pushing for a more independent and assertive foreign policy, maybe even expanding their military.
Wait, so Japan might go rogue?
Not necessarily rogue, but they are exploring their options. They have to balance their economic interests with their security concerns, and that means figuring out a very complex relationship with both China and America.
This is getting more and more complicated. It's like everyone is trying to figure out their next move on the chessboard, and each move could trigger a whole chain reaction.
That's a great way to put it. And one country that often gets overlooked in these discussions is India.
India, why are they so important?
Well, for one, India is the world's largest democracy, And their success shows that democracy isn't just a Western idea. Plus, India's location makes it a natural counterbalance to China.
So America should be getting closer to India.
The book argues that America should definitely be engaging with India more actively, both directly and in discussions about regional security, especially in Central Asia, where China and Russia are both trying to increase their influence.
Okay, so we've got Europe, China, Russia, Japan, and now India. It's like a five-dimensional chess game.
It is incredibly complex. And the book stresses that America's strategy can't be a rigid set of rules. It has to be flexible, able to adapt as the world changes.
So no fixed playbook, just constant adaptation. That makes sense. But is there a larger vision here? A long-term goal for a more stable world?
The book talks about this ambitious concept called a Trans-Eurasian Security System, or TESS.
What is that? Some kind of super alliance?
It's a vision for a security structure that includes all of Eurasia. Imagine America, Europe, China, Japan, Russia, and India, all working together to maintain peace and prevent any one power from becoming too dominant.
It sounds like a utopian dream. Do you really think that's possible?
It's certainly ambitious, and it would require a huge amount of trust and cooperation, but it's also a compelling vision for a more peaceful and prosperous future.
I guess that's the big question we're left with. Can America and the world find a way to build a more cooperative world order, or are we doomed to repeat the same cycles of conflict and competition?
It's a question that will define the 21st century. And it's a question that leads us to the final part of our deep dive.
All right, we're back and ready to dig deeper into this grand chessboard. We've set up the board, found the major players, and even uncovered those potential trouble spots. Now, let's get strategic with this. What's America's game plan? How do they stay on top in this ever-changing global landscape?
That's the big question, and the book lays out some pretty bold recommendations. Let's start with Europe. The author sees a strong and united Europe as absolutely crucial for American interests. He calls it a democratic bridgehead on the Eurasian continent.
So it's like Europe's this base for spreading democracy eastward.
Exactly. But there's a catch. The book acknowledges that the push for European integration has kind of lost its momentum. Remember those things that really drove the European project? The memory of World War II, the need to rebuild their economies, the threat from the Soviet Union. Those aren't as powerful now.
So what's keeping the European Union together then?
The book suggests it's mostly bureaucratic momentum at this point. The institutions are there, they keep pushing for more integration, but public enthusiasm has waned. It's like a car, coasting downhill after running out of gas.
And we can't forget about those tensions within Europe itself. We talked about the Franco-German relationship, how it's important but also kind of strained.
There's a fascinating power dynamic there. Germany, since reunification, has become more assertive on the world stage.
So they're not content to just follow France's lead anymore.
Not quite. Germany's more willing to pursue its own interests, even when they clash with France's. And then you have Britain, always a bit skeptical of the whole European project. They've always seen themselves as separate from mainland Europe, hesitant to fully commit to this idea of a united Europe.
Okay, so Europe has its own internal drama going on. How does America handle all of this and help create a more unified Europe?
Well, the book says America needs to be more proactive. Talking about supporting united Europe isn't enough. America needs to back it up with real action.
Put our money where our mouth is, right?
Exactly. The book suggests that America should embrace the European Union as a real partner and work towards creating new ways to make decisions together across the Atlantic. It's like going from a casual friendship to a serious power couple.
And what about NATO? Where does that fit in?
The book sees NATO expansion as a key part of the strategy. The idea is to extend NATO's security umbrella further east, bringing more of Central Europe under its protection.
Doesn't that upset Russia, though? They see NATO expansion as a threat.
That's the biggest challenge. The book acknowledges Russia's concerns, but argues that a larger NATO could actually create more stability in the long run.
So reassuring Russia that NATO isn't their enemy, but a potential partner for a secure Europe.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's move over to the east side of the Eurasian chessboard to China. The book seems to have a different perspective on how America should approach this rising power.
The book cautions against this common fear of China. There's this assumption that China is destined to become the next superpower, that they'll be hostile and aggressive. But the author challenges that narrative.
So not everyone believes the whole China's going to take over the world thing.
Not exactly. The book argues that China's rise to global domination isn't a sure thing. they still face some serious internal problems.
We talked about those earlier, the social and economic inequality, the potential for unrest, and the conflict between their economic and political systems. Those are big obstacles to overcome.
They are. And the book also suggests that focusing on containing China is the wrong way to go. It'd probably backfire and create even more hostility.
So instead of boxing China in, we should be looking for ways to work with them.
That's the book's argument. The idea is to build a strategic partnership with China, finding common ground on issues like trade and climate change, while also addressing the areas where we disagree.
But what about Taiwan? That's a major point of contention between the U.S. and China.
It is. But the book stresses that even on these really tough issues, dialogue and engagement are better than confrontation.
It's a tough balancing act, trying to cooperate and compete at the same time.
It is. And that leads us to another key player in all of this, Japan.
Right, Japan. They're America's closest ally in the region, but they also have this delicate relationship with China to manage.
Exactly.
Mm.
Economically tied to China, but reliant on America for security. It's a difficult situation.
The book talks about the Yoshida Doctrine, which essentially kept Japan focused on its economy and under America's protection for decades. But now that the Cold War is over, people are rethinking that approach.
That's true. Some in Japan are pushing for a more independent, assertive foreign policy, maybe even strengthening their military.
Hold on, so is Japan going rogue?
Not necessarily rogue, but they are weighing their options. They have to balance economic interests with security concerns, and that means navigating a very tricky relationship with both China and America.
This is getting more complicated by the minute. It's like everyone's trying to figure out their next move on this chessboard, and each move could have a huge ripple effect.
It really is. And there's another player in this whole Eurasian mix that often gets overlooked, India.
India, I don't usually hear them mentioned with the big players like China and Russia.
They're often overlooked. But the book argues that India is a crucial piece of the puzzle. They're the world's largest democracy, and their success challenges the idea that democracy is just a Western concept.
And their location makes them a natural counterbalance to China.
You got it. The book suggests that America should be more actively involved with India, both directly and in talks about regional security, especially in Central Asia, where China and Russia are both vying for control.
Okay, so we've got Europe, China, Russia, Japan, and now India. It's a five-dimensional chess match.
It's incredibly complex, and the book emphasizes that America's grand strategy can't be a rigid set of rules. It needs to be flexible and adaptable, constantly changing as the world changes.
No fixed playbook, just constant adaptation. Makes sense. But is there a bigger picture here? A long-term goal for creating a more stable world?
Well, the book talks about this really ambitious concept called a Trans-Eurasian Security System, or TESS.
What's that? Some sort of mega alliance?
It's an idea for a security structure that covers all of Eurasia. Imagine America, Europe, China, Japan, Russia, and India all working together to keep the peace and prevent any single power from becoming too strong.
It sounds like a utopian dream. Is that even possible?
It's a very ambitious goal, and it would require building a lot of trust and cooperation, but it's also a compelling vision for a more peaceful and prosperous world.
I guess that's the big question we're left with, right? Can America and the rest of the world create a more cooperative world order, or are we going to keep repeating the same patterns of conflict and competition?
That's the question that will define the 21st century, and it's a question that takes us to the final part of our deep dive.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the grand chessboard. We've explored all the strategies, the alliances, the potential conflicts, even this idea of a trans-Eurasian security system. It's been a lot.
It has, but the book goes even further. It asks some really tough questions about American power and its limits, taking us to a whole new level.
Okay, I'm ready. What's the book saying about American power? Lay it on me.
Well, it starts by pointing out that America's global position is truly unique. It's a different kind of power, one that's based on those core values of American democracy.
We've talked about that before, right? The idea that American power is different from those old empires. It's more about networks and working together than just brute force or cultural domination.
Exactly. And the book argues that this approach, while powerful, has its downsides.
Yeah.
It makes American power adaptable and resilient, but it also makes it vulnerable to internal divisions and those external pressures.
So America being a democracy, could that actually make it harder to stay on top in the long run? How does that work?
Think about it. Democracies are less focused on just grabbing power. They're more concerned with what's happening at home, less willing to make the tough calls sometimes needed for, building and maintaining an empire.
I see what you mean. It's harder to get people behind risky foreign policy moves when they're worried about healthcare and education at home.
Exactly. And as America becomes even more diverse, it might be even tougher to get everyone on the same page about foreign policy, especially if there's no immediate threat to America.
So, those things that make America unique, like democracy and diversity, could also be weaknesses when it comes to global leadership.
That's a key argument the book makes. It also worries about cultural shifts in America, shifts that could weaken its global role.
Like what kinds of shifts?
It talks about growing anxiety and pessimism in Western societies, a decline in those traditional values, and a rise in, seeking pleasure above all else.
So basically, people becoming more self-centered and less concerned about the bigger picture.
You could put it that way. And the book suggests this could make America less willing to carry the weight of global leadership.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. What happens if America does step back? Who fills the void? Would that even be a good thing?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And the book doesn't paint a very pretty picture of a world without America in charge.
Be straight with me. How bad could it get?
It talks about the possibility of global chaos, a world consumed by ethnic conflicts, mass migrations, terrorism, maybe even the use of weapons of mass destruction. Definitely not a world we want.
So the author is saying that America, for all its faults, is still the best bet for keeping some kind of order in the world.
That's the argument. It's not about glorifying America or forgetting its mistakes, but about recognizing that things could get a lot worse without their leadership.
All right, but let's be real. America's power won't last forever. What happens then? What kind of legacy should they be aiming for?
The book addresses that directly. It says America's ultimate goal should be to create a world that's more stable, more cooperative, one that doesn't need America to step in all the time.
So empowering other countries, building strong partnerships, and fostering this idea of shared responsibility for global security.
Exactly. And the book highlights some encouraging trends that are already happening. The rise of those multinational corporations, NGOs, and all these international networks. They're creating a more connected world, one that's less dependent on those old power structures.
So even as America's influence fades, these new ways of working together could step in.
That's the hope. But the book ends with a warning. It reminds us that the future is uncertain, and the choices we make now will determine the kind of world we leave behind.
No pressure then, right? But seriously, we have a responsibility to make the right choices for a better future, even when the path isn't clear.
Absolutely. The world is complex, constantly changing. The grand chessboard helps us understand the challenges and opportunities ahead.
This deep dive has been amazing, full insights and stuff that really makes you think. Feels like I just took a crash course in geopolitics. What's the biggest takeaway for you?
For me, it's the reminder that we're not just watching this global game from the sidelines. We all have a role in shaping the future, and understanding what's happening is the first step to making a real difference.
So true. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Grand Chessboard. It's a book that sticks with you, and it's definitely worth reading if you want to grasp the world we live in. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking critically about those forces shaping our future.